What if the darkest chapter in your town's history had been erased on purpose? What if someone, long ago, decided that certain crimes were too horrifying to be remembered? And what if, buried deep beneath government files and dust, the evidence was still waiting for you to find it? It was the fall of 1988. The air in Ravenwood carried that familiar metallic chill, a reminder of the factories that once made this Illinois town proud. Down in the basement of the county archives, historian Daniel Cross was alone among the shadows. He'd been working there for weeks, sorting through forgotten industrial records for his research on early 20th century steel production. The room smelled of mold, cold concrete, and decaying paper. The single fluorescent lamp above him flickered like an old film reel. He was used to the monotony, dust, numbers, invoices. But that evening, something different caught his eye. Behind a collapsed shelf, half buried in rubble, lay a metal box, no larger than a typewriter case. Its surface was rough with corrosion, but faint letters could still be read through the grime. RWPD, Confidential/1905, Ravenwood Police Department. Daniel hesitated. The latch was rusted shut. He brushed off the thick layer of dust, and as he did, he noticed something else. Painted and dried, flaking red ink across the lid. To be destroyed, never registered. His pulse quickened. He knew better than to tamper with sealed police property. But curiosity, the same instinct that made him a historian, pushed stronger than caution. He found a screwdriver in his satchel and carefully wedged it beneath the lock. The metal groaned, snapped, and the lid creaked open with a sigh, releasing a breath of air that smelled of rust and something faintly sweet, almost chemical. Inside, beneath a sheet of decayed linen, were photographs, letters, and typed reports on yellowed paper. Some were marked evidence. Others carried the faded insignia of the Ravenwood Police Department. The first photo made him pause. It showed a large brick mansion surrounded by leafless trees. The front porch sagged, windows darkened. On the back, written in pencil, Whitmore Residence, March 1905. Daniel frowned. He had heard that name before. The Whitmore family had owned one of the region's first ironworks, a dynasty that vanished overnight after a fire destroyed their estate. Locals said it was haunted ground. But here, in his hands, was proof that something more had happened. He pulled out a folded document clipped to a police seal. The paper was brittle, corners eaten by time. Incident report, restricted access. Case 417A. Property of the Ravenwood Police Department. The first paragraph was typed unevenly, as if by trembling hands. Following an anonymous report, authorities conducted a discreet investigation at the residence of Dr. Gregory Whitmore, located on Sycamore Hill Road. Findings suggest activities of an unclassified and potentially unlawful nature. Recommendation: full suppression until federal evaluation. Daniel's eyes moved to the final line, handwritten in red pencil. Containment advised. No public record. He leaned back in his chair. The fluorescent light buzzed louder. From somewhere in the far end of the basement came the slow, rhythmic drip of a leaking pipe, steady as a heartbeat. Who was Gregory Whitmore? What did they find in his house that had to be erased from history? And why, after more than 80 years, was this file still here, hidden behind a wall of forgotten boxes? Daniel didn't know it yet, but opening that box would change everything he believed about Ravenwood and about death itself. Because the Whitmore case hadn't ended in 1905. It had simply been waiting. According to the police files Daniel found, Dr. Gregory Whitmore was once considered the pride of Ravenwood. An inventor, a visionary, the man who brought light and labor to this corner of Illinois. He owned Whitmore Ironworks, a sprawling factory on the edge of town where hundreds of men forged the rails and machines that built America's heartland. Local newspapers called him the engineer of progress. But behind that perfect public image, the documents painted a different picture. Neighbors described him as eccentric, withdrawn, a man who stopped attending church after his only son, Michael, died suddenly from scarlet fever in 1902. His wife, Elizabeth Whitmore, once the darling of Ravenwood society, was said to have fallen into silence after the boy's funeral. She rarely left the house, and when she did, people whispered that she looked like a ghost herself. The Whitmore estate stood just beyond the factory, an enormous mansion of glass and steel that locals nicknamed the Glass House. It had been built with the same precision as a laboratory, and some claimed it was one. The servants who worked there told strange stories in their statements to police. They spoke of nights when the lights in the basement burned bright until dawn, when strange metallic humming echoed through the ground, and when the sharp odor of chemicals drifted into the garden. One maid said she once saw her employer through the glass wall of his laboratory, hands trembling, face pale under the electric light, speaking softly to something she couldn't see. Elizabeth, the mistress of the house, had forbidden anyone to enter the basement. "It's where he keeps his experiments," she reportedly told her staff. "Don't go near the glass room, ever." Still, one of the workers claimed that, late one night, he heard a faint sound coming from below, a sound that made his blood freeze. It wasn't the hiss of machines. It was crying, a child's crying. In the final pages of the report, the chief investigator had scribbled a note in the margin. Locals claim Whitmore speaks of reversing the decay of life, suggests surveillance, possible mental instability. But the surveillance never came. In early April 1905, the first complaints began to surface. Rumors of missing vagrants near the factory, of stray animals disappearing from the streets. And somewhere deep beneath the glass house, Dr. Whitmore worked through the night, chasing what he called the spark of resurrection. By midsummer of 1905, the tone of the Whitmore reports changed. The early entries spoke of eccentric science, of harmless obsession. But the newer ones, written by the Pinkerton detectives hired by the state, used colder words. Unclassified experiments, unknown substances, possible human subjects. The detectives had been sent to Ravenwood after a string of disappearances near the ironworks. Most of the missing were vagrants, men and women who had drifted into town looking for work. Locals said they saw Dr. Whitmore himself offering them jobs, temporary night shifts, as he called them. None of those workers were ever seen again. The Pinkertons began their surveillance quietly, posing as factory inspectors. One of them, Agent J. T. Colburn, described the mansion in his notes. The Whitmore estate appears active every night past midnight. The lower windows emit a pale blue light, inconsistent with normal illumination. Electrical wiring seems to run directly from the factory to the house basement. When the current surges, a low vibration can be felt through the ground, like thunder trapped beneath the soil. Inside the glass house, things were even worse. The servants' testimonies painted a picture of a home consumed by fear. Elizabeth Whitmore stopped eating with her husband. She avoided the west wing altogether, where the laboratory entrance was hidden behind a steel door. Martha, the housemaid, told investigators, "The missus would stand in the hall listening. I'd hear her whisper, 'You're playing God, Gregory. Stop this madness before it takes you too.' Then she'd cry. I never saw her cry before that year." The butler, Thomas, resigned after hearing metal scraping against bone. He claimed that when he tried to warn Mrs. Whitmore, she begged him not to speak of it again. Others stayed silent, fear of losing their jobs or something worse. Then the children began to disappear. At first, people blamed the river. It was summer, and kids often played near the water. But when the third child went missing, a boy from the workers' housing, the sheriff had no choice but to investigate. 2 days later, they found a body downstream, caught in the reeds. It was a boy of about 8. The coroner's notes were brief but chilling. Skin marked with irregular scars. Blue discoloration along veins, possibly chemical burns. Puncture wounds near the neck and wrists, no explanation found. That same night, according to a neighbor's statement, lights in the Whitmore basement flared so bright they could be seen across the cornfields. Some claimed they heard the echo of a scream, a sound like metal tearing through flesh. When questioned, Dr. Whitmore dismissed everything as superstition. He said he was testing electrical conductivity on synthetic tissue. But one of the Pinkertons wrote in the margin of his report, "Doctor may be experimenting on live donors. Recommend immediate seizure of premises." That order was never signed. The local sheriff refused to act without a warrant, and by the time the paperwork reached Springfield, 2 more people had vanished. Elizabeth Whitmore stopped leaving her room entirely. Neighbors saw her standing at her window at night, her face white in the moonlight, staring toward the basement door below. And inside that house, beneath the glass floors and polished marble, something moved in the dark. Something that should have never been alive again. When the Pinkertons finally entered the Whitmore mansion in October 1905, what they found beneath the floorboards of the glass house would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The basement had 3 distinct chambers, each more disturbing than the last. The first was a chemical laboratory, lined with glassware and brass pipes. Coils of copper wire snaked across the walls, connected to humming generators that smelled of ozone and scorched metal. Jars of liquid filled the shelves, their contents sealed behind thick glass. Some held what looked like organs, preserved, labeled, and arranged by size. Others contained a translucent solution that shimmered faintly when touched by light, as if it were alive. The second room was an operating chamber. A single metal table stood in the center, bolted to the floor. Leather restraints hung from its sides. Scattered surgical instruments, scalpels, clamps, and syringes, lay blackened with age. The floor was covered with a dark residue that the detectives first mistook for rust. It wasn't rust. Pinned to the far wall was a sheet of yellowed paper, a sketch of the human circulatory system, marked with hand-drawn notes in blue ink. Next to it, written in Dr. Whitmore's own elegant script, was a phrase, "Transfer of vital energy, theoretical only." But the most unsettling place of all was the third room, the sealed chamber. The steel door had been locked from the outside. Inside, the air was damp, heavy with the odor of formaldehyde and something far worse, something sweet, like decayed flowers. A table stood at the center, surrounded by broken glass cylinders. A large copper apparatus rose behind it, crowned with metal rods and insulated cables that connected to a wall generator. The device had the shape of a spine, tubes branching like ribs, wires pulsing faintly with leftover static. In one corner, investigators found open journals, their pages warped by moisture. The handwriting was uneven, almost feverish. Life can be preserved. The spark is within the tissue. All I need is energy from another living source. Another page read, "The body dies only when the current ceases. If I sustain the flow, death can be postponed, perhaps even reversed." And scrawled across the margin in darker ink, "The animal trials succeeded. Human trials will prove the final equation." The official forensic notes from that day were brief but damning. Evidence of surgical intervention on living subjects. Traces of blood on instruments indicate premortem incisions. Recommend immediate suspension of property owner and federal review. But no review ever came. The report was quietly buried. The photographs sealed. The surviving officers transferred. And though the investigators swore they'd shut down every machine before leaving, townsfolk later claimed they could still hear the hum of electricity beneath the hill, long after the mansion had gone dark. It was said that on quiet nights, if you stood near the ruins and listened closely, you could hear something faint, like a pulse, echoing from deep underground. Among the documents in the Whitmore file, Daniel Cross found a deposition marked confidential statement of N. Whitmore. The handwriting was uneven, as if written under duress. Nicholas Whitmore, age 23, student of mechanical engineering at the University of Chicago, had returned home that summer to visit his parents. What he witnessed there became the foundation of the investigation. He began his statement with a line that felt almost apologetic. My father believed he was serving science. I believed him too, until the night I saw what he had done. Nicholas described how his father's obsession had deepened after Michael's death. Dr. Whitmore had begun collecting scientific journals, books on physiology, and obscure German texts on galvanism and tissue preservation. The family's fortune had slowly drained into the construction of new devices in the basement. He told me, Nicholas wrote, "Help me and I'll change the world. Refuse and I'll do it alone." He said it wasn't madness, it was compassion. He wanted to cure death itself. The young man recalled the first time his father allowed him inside the sealed chamber. The air was icy and sharp with chemicals. Light shimmered off glass tanks that lined the walls. At the center of the room stood a large transparent cylinder, filled with a viscous, yellowish fluid. Inside it was Michael. He wasn't decaying, Nicholas wrote. He looked asleep, perfectly preserved. Father said he'd found a formula that stopped corruption at the cellular level. He said Michael just needed a little more time. Beside the cylinder stood a towering contraption of brass and copper coils. Thick wires wound around a rotating core, connected to a dynamo that hummed with low, steady power. His father called it the conduit. He said it could transfer vitality, Nicholas continued, take the living energy from one organism and deliver it to another. He called it the bridge between worlds. For weeks, Gregory Whitmore kept his son at his side, forcing him to record data, measure voltages, and observe donors. The word he used for the people brought into the lab at night. Most were unconscious when Nicholas saw them. Some were not. He told me they were volunteers, people who wanted to serve science. I wanted to believe him, but when I looked at them, at their eyes, I knew they hadn't chosen this. The statement grew darker toward the end. Nicholas described a night when his father claimed the final stage was ready. He said the source must be pure, innocent, unspoiled by sin. He said a child's vitality is the strongest because it is nearest to creation. That night, Gregory Whitmore brought in a boy 7, maybe 8 years old, the son of a laundress who worked at the factory. The child had been promised food and a warm bed. He told me the boy would not suffer. He said the current would be quick like lightning. He wanted me to activate the switch. Nicholas refused. He begged his father to stop. But Dr. Whitmore's eyes, he wrote, looked like glass, bright, empty, and reflecting only the machine. He shouted, "You don't understand, Nicholas. I can bring him back. Michael will open his eyes tonight." That was the last thing Nicholas remembered clearly before the surge of light and the sound that followed. A sound he could never describe. The report ended with one chilling line, written in a different hand, perhaps that of a police clerk. Subject displays symptoms of shock. Continues to insist the body of Michael Whitmore moved. The signature beneath it was barely legible. smeared by what looked like water stains or tears. It was the night of October 14, 1905, the night the Whitmore mansion finally came alive. By the time the sheriff and the Pinkertons arrived, lightning split the sky over Ravenwood, turning the ironworks into a maze of trembling shadows. Neighbors had reported screams, strange flashes of blue light, and the deafening hum of machinery. As the officers forced the door open, a wave of ozone and scorched metal hit them in the face. The entire house shook as if a storm raged inside it. From beneath the floor came the sound of grinding gears and something else. A low moan, half human, half mechanical. They followed the light down the basement stairs. It poured out from under the steel door like liquid fire, casting their shadows long against the wall. Someone was shouting inside. When the door was broken open, the scene froze them in place. At the center of the room, the conduit machine roared with blinding power. Sparks leapt from its copper coils, arching through the air like blue lightning. Two tables stood side by side. On one lay the body of the laundress's boy, his skin gray and sunken, his veins dark and shriveled as if the life had been drained from him. On the other, Michael Whitmore, eyes open, one detective wrote later, muscles twitching, the jaw moved as though trying to speak. Dr. Gregory Whitmore stood beside him, trembling, soaked in sweat and blood. His voice broke as he screamed, "He's alive! You fools, he's alive!" The air reeked of electricity and rot. The machinery hissed, sputtered, and then died with a final burst of light that plunged the basement into darkness. When the officers dragged Whitmore away, he fought like a man possessed, shouting words that made no sense. "You can't stop him. He's waiting for me." The official photograph attached to the file is almost too blurred to decipher. But even through the damage and age, one thing stands out: the shape on the table, its head tilted toward the camera, eyes wide open, mouth half-formed in an expression of agony or awakening. And in the margin, a final handwritten note. Recommend destruction of all evidence. The subject appears responsive. The official report dated February 2, 1906, reads like the quiet end to a tragedy that never should have happened. Dr. Gregory Whitmore, age 48, was declared legally insane by the State Court of Illinois and transferred under armed escort to Springfield Asylum for the Criminally Insane. The diagnosis: monomania brought on by the loss of a child, accompanied by delusional fixation on reanimation and divine purpose. The newspapers printed a sanitized version of the story. They called him a distinguished scientist turned madman, accused of illegal anatomical experiments and grave defilement. But behind those headlines, another document circulated, one not meant for the public. Stamped top secret, it bore the seal of the Department of War Research. All recovered equipment from the Whitmore residence and laboratory to be seized for government evaluation. Subject demonstrated unprecedented understanding of bioelectrical transference and artificial tissue preservation. Further study may yield applications of military value. The confiscated journals, sketches, and laboratory notes were shipped to Washington under guard. None of them were ever seen again. As for the mansion, the authorities acted quickly. The structure was sealed, the windows boarded, the basement door welded shut. Within a year, the glass house was demolished entirely. The land was flattened and renamed Sycamore Hill Park, a gift to the citizens of Ravenwood. The public never knew what had been buried beneath their new green space. But one note in the archival ledger, written in red pencil and underlined twice, stood apart from the bureaucratic calm of the rest. All items secured. Containment successful. Subject expired after claiming his son had found him again. The asylum's internal correspondence fills in the blanks. On the night of his death, Dr. Whitmore had grown agitated. refusing his medication and demanding to see the warden. He was heard muttering, "He's here. He's come for me. I can hear him breathing." When the staff entered his cell after midnight, they found him lying on the floor, eyes open, mouth twisted in a strange smile. There were small marks on his neck and chest, faint bruises shaped like the fingers of a child. The attending physician described them as post-mortem discolorations. But in the margin of his report, someone else, perhaps another doctor, had written only 3 words. They were fresh. Whitmore was buried in an unmarked grave behind the asylum walls. No family claimed the body. Elizabeth Whitmore had died months earlier from an overdose of laudanum. Their surviving son, Nicholas, left the country, destination unknown. The town of Ravenwood began to heal, or at least pretended to. But even years later, those who walked through Sycamore Hill Park swore they could feel something beneath their feet. A low hum, like a machine still breathing in the dark earth below. And sometimes, when the wind turned cold, mothers claimed they could hear it faintly through the rustling leaves, a whisper that sounded almost like a child calling for his father. Daniel Cross couldn't sleep the night he found the Whitmore file. The words, the photographs, the blood-stained pages, they followed him long after he'd locked the archive doors. By morning, curiosity had turned into something else. A pull. He needed to see the place for himself. Ravenwood's Sycamore Hill Park sat on the western edge of town, quiet and unremarkable. Families walked their dogs there, children played, and joggers passed beneath the maples without a second glance at the fountain in the center. But Daniel felt it the moment he stepped through the gates. That hum, deep in the ground, faint as a memory. The fountain was made of old stone, its surface darkened by years of rain. The water shimmered under the pale autumn sun, and for an instant he thought it looked red. Not bright like blood, but soft and cloudy, as though the color came from within the stone itself. A frail voice broke his thoughts. An elderly woman sat on a nearby bench feeding breadcrumbs to pigeons. When she caught him staring at the water, she smiled without warmth. "We call it the Red Fountain," she said. "Doesn't matter how many times the city drains it, scrubs it, paints it. Within a week, the water goes red again." Daniel hesitated. "Why? Do people know why?" She shrugged. "Old stories, that's all. My grandmother used to say a doctor built his house here, one who tried to cheat death. They tore it down after the fire, but the ground never forgot." Her gaze turned toward the fountain as if afraid to look too long. "Kids dare each other to drink from it at Halloween," she added quietly. "But they never do it twice." The wind shifted, carrying the smell of wet earth and something metallic. Daniel moved closer to the edge, staring at the ripples. The red tone deepened, almost pulsing. He blinked, and for a fraction of a second he saw a face beneath the surface. A child's, pale, eyes open. He stumbled back, heart racing. When he looked again, the water was clear. Only sunlight, only reflection. Then he noticed the boy. He stood a few yards away, on the far side of the fountain, thin, motionless, dressed in old-fashioned clothes. A wool vest, short trousers, boots polished to a dull shine. His skin looked colorless in the afternoon light. Daniel called out softly, "Hey, are you lost?" The boy turned his head slowly. His eyes were bright, too bright, almost silver. His voice was calm, nearly a whisper. "I'm waiting for my father," he said. "He promised to bring me back." Daniel froze. The boy's lips barely moved, and yet Daniel heard the words as if they were spoken right beside his ear. He blinked once, and the boy was gone. Only the fountain remained, the water swirling lazily, red again under the dying light. Behind him, the old woman rose from her bench, gathering her crumbs. She glanced over her shoulder and said softly, almost to herself, "Sometimes he talks to strangers, but only the ones who open the wrong box." Daniel stood there long after she left, the hum beneath his feet growing stronger, steady as a heartbeat. And in the whisper of the wind, he could almost hear a child's voice, calling from deep below the park. 30 years had passed since Daniel Cross opened the Whitmore file. Time had blurred the edges of those memories, but never erased them. He had built a life, became a professor at the University of Illinois, published respected books, lectured on American industrial expansion. To his students, he was brilliant, composed, a man grounded in facts. None of them knew how often he woke at night, hearing the soft hum of electricity in the dark. He never spoke of the box, never mentioned the file or the red water or the boy by the fountain. He told himself it had been imagination, a historian's mind weaving myth from coincidence. Until one gray afternoon, during a graduate seminar, a student raised his hand. "Professor Cross," the young man said, flipping through his notes, "have you ever heard of something called the Red Fountain Files? My grandfather worked in the Ravenwood archives in the 1980s. Before he died, he said he found documents that were different, files the state ordered destroyed. He said they talked about resurrection experiments." The room went silent. Daniel's pen slipped from his fingers. His throat tightened. "Where did you hear that name?" he asked, his voice lower than he meant it to be. The student shrugged. "It's just a local story. They say the government covered it up. Something about a scientist who tried to bring his kid back from the dead." A laugh rippled through the class, but Daniel didn't smile. He dismissed them early that day. That evening, unable to resist, he drove back to Ravenwood. The park was still there, tidier now, smaller. The old oaks were gone, replaced by a playground and a row of benches facing the fountain. The red fountain had been shut down for maintenance. Its basin was empty, a hollow stone mouth catching leaves. Next to it stood a new bronze plaque. Former site of the Whitmore Mansion, 1905 to 1906. Dedicated to the spirit of progress and remembrance. Daniel stared at the words, unable to move. They had turned horror into heritage. He sat on the same bench where the old woman once fed pigeons, his breath visible in the cool evening air. Somewhere beneath the soil lay the remnants of the glass house, sealed for more than a century. He closed his eyes and listened. First, nothing. Only the distant hum of traffic. Then, faintly, another sound, almost imperceptible. A whisper, soft and childish, close to his ear though no one was there. "Don't tell them." Daniel's eyes flew open. The park was empty, the air completely still. "Let Father finish." The voice lingered, echoing through the hollow of the fountain, twisting into a low electrical buzz that vibrated through the bench beneath him. He rose to his feet, trembling, heart hammering in his chest. The water system was dry, the pipes disconnected, and yet from deep within the stone came a faint drip, drip, drip. He turned to leave, but before he reached the gate, he heard one more sound, a soft exhale, like the sigh of a sleeping child. For the first time in decades, Daniel realized the truth. The experiment had never ended. It had only changed its host. The restoration began quietly, just another city project, another contract signed without knowing what slept beneath. In early spring, construction crews drained the red fountain to replace its foundation. The workers joked about the old legend, laughing as their shovels struck stone. But by the third day, the laughter stopped. Beneath the fountain's base, they found a layer of sealed concrete. When they broke through, a cold draft rose from below, carrying the scent of earth and rust. At the bottom of the pit lay a narrow doorway, its edges blackened, It seems welded shut for nearly a century. Inside was a single chamber no larger than a cellar. The air was thick and unmoving. Their flashlights revealed a stone table, its surface scarred and stained dark with age. Beside it, iron restraints eaten by rust, and scattered across the floor, twisted fragments of copper and glass, pieces of a machine no one could identify. On the far wall, written in white chalk that somehow survived the decades, were 3 words: "Still waiting, Michael." City officials sealed the room that same evening. The workers were told not to speak of what they'd seen. But someone took a photograph before the entrance was closed again. A photo that spread quietly online, only to vanish within hours. For the first time in 100 years, the fountain's water ran clear. Tourists came to see it, calling it a miracle. Then, 1 week later, a 7-year-old boy disappeared from a playground 2 blocks away. He was never found. The next morning, the water in the fountain was red again. Daniel Cross returned to the park soon after. He stood before the rippling surface, older now, his reflection trembling in the crimson pool. For a moment, he saw another reflection beside his own. A pale child's face, eyes bright and unblinking, watching him from beneath the water. Then he felt it. A shadow stretching behind him, cold and heavy. He didn't need to turn to know who stood there. A deep, familiar voice whispered, "We're almost finished, son." The air cracked, a flash of blue light, and then, only silence. The screen fades to black. Somewhere, in the hum of the fountain's hidden pipes, electricity stirs again.